us now. Only love.
Hello, and welcome to Moving Forward, a production of the Bay and Grantstown Advancement Association. On this program, we focus on identifying obstacles to the progress of our nation. And with the assistance of in-house guests and you, the general public, we attempt to address these obstacles with a view to reducing, if not eliminating them. My name is Reverend C.B. Moss, your host, and welcome to the program this evening. As this is the first program for the new year, please permit us to extend season's greetings to all of you and wish you a very happy, prosperous, healthy new year. This evening we're going to discuss a subject that is very, very important, and it is even more important at this time of the year, and that is majority rule in the Bahamas and all that that embodies. Majority Rule Day was established in the Bahamas on January 10th, 1967. This date, however, should not be viewed in isolation, as in a vacuum, as if it just materialized. Indeed, Majority Rule Day was one event, albeit a very, very important event on the long march for racial, political, social, and economic freedom of the Bahamian masses. Contrary to popular belief and narrative, the success of majority rule was not achieved exclusively by politicians. It was in fact driven for many decades prior to 1967 by Bahamian workers and labor unions. And here to discuss this not as well-known phase of the progressive struggle in the Bahamas are two eminently qualified individuals. We've had each of them on this program before, and we are delighted to have them back with us again. And I refer to my right, Dr. Chris Curry, lecturer and professor at the University of the Bahamas, and his specialty is history.
Yes.
Bahamian history.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
He is so knowledgeable and has so much information, as you will see over the next little while. And assisting us also in discussing this topic is the eminent legal mind and also a labor leader of distinction, Mr. ObieFerguson, President of the Trade Union Congress, and a long-time labor leader in this country. Gentlemen, welcome, and good to have you back with us.
It's a pleasure being with you, Mr. Moss.
Great. Now, we want to segment this program so that it flows. We want to talk about the long march, because that's what I call it, because it was indeed a long march. Many of us feel that it happened in '67. Some of us may go back to 1958 strike. Some of us may even go back to Burma Road, 1942, but indeed it started before that. And our distinguished professor is going to give us that background information to bring us forward from the early days.
Yeah, I think it's good to start with a period of enslavement, if I could say that.
Yes.
Formal enslavement in Bahamas began in 1648 with the arrival of the Lutheran adventurers. And from the inception, we know the enslaved persons always resisted enslavement. Hilary Beckles, one of our noted Caribbean scholars, has argued that the enslaved declared a 200-year war on slavery. And everything that they did and everything that they said, they were declaring themselves as free men and women. They were resisting the coerced labor environment in which they were involuntarily placed. And in the Bahamas, then, we could draw attention to the number of revolts that occurred during this formal period of slavery as sort of maybe the starting point of the labor movement in the Bahamas. So for example, in 1787, in Abaco, of all places, persons who were actually free, these are black loyalists that had been given certificates of freedom for their alliance with the British during the American Revolution, and coming to the Bahamas, white loyalists were trying to re-enslave them. So in an effort to collectively demonstrate the unwillingness to be re-enslaved, they absconded from their work environments, they hid in the woods, they armed themselves, and they refused to work. And it took Lord Dunmore arriving in Abaco in May of 1788 to actually establish a special court. He called it a Negro court, where he would hear and adjudicate the cases before him. Of the 30 that came before that court in Abaco, 29 were ruled by Lord Dunmore as actually enslaved, which was absolutely tragic in my opinion, because none of them were in fact enslaved. All of them were likely black loyalists who rightfully should have been freed and given a fair adjudication. But it speaks to, at that time in our history, the injustice, if I could put it that way, of the whole labor system.
Well, that's the only way you can put it.
Yeah, yes. Reaching for other words, but certainly that was the case.
Yes.
And so that really is an example, and we have many others during the period of formal slavery. We have Pompey, who heroically, along with others, took that boat and sailed to Nassau to belong to Lord Rolle, and put their case before a governor they thought was sympathetic to their cause. That would have been James Carmichael Smith.
Yeah.
He puts them in the workhouse. He sends them back to Exuma with soldiers in tow to ensure that they return to work. And so that is another example of labor protest working at the moment of slavery. You have individualized cases of people like Black Dick and Cat Island on Hunter's Plantation. You have Alec and Matilda on Farquharson's Plantation in San Salvador. All of these represent a growing anti-slavery movement led in fact by black abolitionists here in the Bahamas. An anti-slavery struggle for sure, but also a labor struggle, demonstrating the unwillingness to work under poor labor conditions, under a coercive labor environment where they were exploited. All of their agitations speak to a nascent kind of proto-political activity that definitely had a labor dimension to it. In the post-emancipation period, we see the same level of agitation. We see it particularly manifested in lodges and friendly societies where they would agitate every year. They would march up to Government House. They would put their remonstrances or their list of grievances before the governor. And at one point, as Gail Saunders has noted in the 1880s, they even took over Trinity Methodist Church, and if you know anything about the history of Trinity, at the time it was an all-white congregation.
Oh, yes.
So the symbolic taking over of Trinity was as equally powerful of an expression of political agitation as was Junkanoo on Bray Street. And so that again is a kind of proto-political activity. And as we march forward into the 20th century, the kind of activism that we see in the labor unrest that takes place in the Caribbean. Fred Franklin Knight, a noted scholar and historian, has called the 1930s in the Caribbean as a turbulent decade. Why? Because you had labor boycotts, you had strikes, you had riots. And while you don't see that happening in the Bahamas really until 1942, I would advance that the activities of blacks in the friendly societies and the Masonic lodges, those sort of reflect the same kind of political agitation that was occurring in the Bahamas, but just not on such a massive level that you saw in the Caribbean.
Well,
but by 1942...
Not in the Caribbean, but don't forget, we had a couple of riots here prior to Burma Road.
Well, there was, and you know, you could argue the magnitude or the level of it. We have a Nagua riot that occurs just before the end of the 1930s. And you also have some other unsettling labor dispute that occurs. Yeah. But 42 seems to be the place where a lot of people would say the quiet revolution really takes hold.
Well, 42, in our view, is when the workers, as a specialty group now, got involved, because going back to 1863, and this is found in the archives of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. In 1863, July, there was a riot in Bay and Grandstown. And that was initiated because of the mistreatment of the natives by the West India Regiment. And that could be considered serious because shots were fired and people were wounded. 30 years later, in 1893, there was a similar riot also in Bay and Grandstown, because Bay and Grandstown people never played. They're going to revolt. And it was so serious. It was so serious that the government sent for an English gunboat to come and subdue the people and place them under control. I think a couple of people were killed in that incident, but 42 was when the workers themselves.
Yeah. But just to retreat, since you raised that and this fantastic information you have there, I would suggest too, part of the reason why you had this sort of unsettling disturbances going on is because, remember, we had an alien police force essentially,
of course.
the West Indian regiments, and this is classic colonial behavior. The colonizers brought in blacks from Barbados and Jamaica to police blacks here in the Bahamas.
That's right.
And this is classic divide and conquer. They tried to keep them separate. In fact, for a long time, they lived in Fort Charlotte. That was their essential barracks.
Yes, of course.
And they, just like the liberated Africans, where they initially tried to keep them separated in Gambia and Adelaide and Carmichael, they tried to do the same thing here with the West Indian soldiers. Ultimately, it did not work, but at least initially they were trying to do, by the 1880s, they tried to reform the police force. Do you know what they do? They allow the West Indian Regiment to continue to provide surveillance and policing, but they're assigned essentially to white merchants.
But that is true, because following the 1863 riot, the residents of Bay and Grandstown said to the government, we will not tolerate the West India Regiment in our community. And they were banished. Those soldiers were banished from Grandstown. They had to stay out.
So that is where they brought in finally a localized police force that were responsible for policing the over the hill areas.
The own people,
but
from
I guess the compromise in all of this was the West Indian forces still remained in the Bahamas.
Oh yes.
But they were conveniently dispensed to.
They kept on the periphery. They never sent them in
to police the white merchant classes' homes because they felt safer with the alien police force.
And not only that, because the residents of over the hill were not going to tolerate them. As a matter of fact, it's there in the records.
And in fact, there was a racist idea behind all of this, because the thought was the white merchants were saying that the local Bain and Grandstown communities had individuals in those communities that could not control their emotions, could not control themselves, and so they would not want an unruly group of people to be a part of a police force that would be responsible for surveying and securing their premises and property.
But that was a fallacy, because...
Yes, it was.
That was a fallacy because the residents of Bay and Grandstown were disciplined people for the most part, but when you push them far enough, and that's why I'm proud of them. I'm proud of the history. As a matter of fact, the genesis of the progressive movement has its roots deeply buried in Bay and Grandstown. Most of the activities, the marches, the demonstrations, the prayer meetings, and all of those events occurred between Southern Recreation Ground and Windsor Park over the hill. This is where everything started.
And you had, to complement everything you've said, they had bazaars, they had fairs.
That's right.
Then they organized the ASU, they organized young leadership conventions. There was a lot of vibrancy in these communities. But a lot of the things they did because they were shut out of a system.
That's right.
For example, the reason why ASU became so important to them was because they could not gain access to insurance and banking facilities because of the racial barriers.
And the truth is, the value of the ASU system to the development of the Bahamas, particularly amongst the masses, cannot really be covered in such a brief period of time. What we're going to do at this point, we're going to introduce our next important guest, Obie Ferguson. The name is synonymous with labor and workers' movement in this country. And Obie, we know that were it not for the workers and later the organized workers in the form of unions and worker organizations, we couldn't have gotten where we are.
Yes, you know, historically, if you look back, you will see that really it was an offense for a small number of persons to get together to even have a discussion. That was a criminal offense. And normally, who would have been the persons who would manage that type of situation would be your employer. So your employer acted as magistrate, it acted as the police officer in some instances, and it's all because they wanted to keep control of the workers. But like anything else, after a period going through various legislation, we eventually ended up with the right to form unions around 1946, thereabout. And as a result, they gave you the right and they took it back from you. Then they come back again and they give it back to you again. And legislation, we start piecing the legislation. And when the 1970 legislation came in, what you had there was the right to be a part of a general union. But when the Progressive Liberal Party became the government, what they did, the very power that caused them to become the government, they changed that to now say in 1970, you can join a union of your craft.
Yes.
Not a union of your choice, but a union of your craft. Because the Constitution provides for you to join a union of your choice.
Well, you know, Brother Obie and Brother Chris, we are going to drill down a little deeper into this, you know. For the most part, we tend to cover the surface of this, this subject. Let's get down a little deeper, but let's do that when we return from this quick break. Don't go away, folks. We'll be right back.
Only love can save us now. Only love.